On a quiet night in a small American town, a man picked up his phone and called 911, his voice steady at first, then breaking in a way that operators don't forget. He said just 3 words. "She's gone again." It sounded simple, almost ordinary, the kind of call that might pass through the system and fade into routine paperwork. But nothing about this case was routine, because when officers arrived at that house, when they stepped past the front door and into a life that looked calm on the surface, they began to uncover something that didn't fit any familiar pattern. This wasn't just about a missing person. It was about trust placed in the wrong hands, about decisions that seemed small at the time, and about a relationship that would quietly collapse in a way no one around them had truly understood. And by the time the truth began to reveal itself, it was already too late to undo what had been set in motion. The man at the center of it all, who we'll call Daniel Carter, had built his life on consistency. He worked the same job for over 2 decades, lived in the same neighborhood, greeted the same people every morning, and kept his world structured in a way that made sense. Friends described him as dependable, the kind of person who didn't invite chaos and certainly didn't go looking for it. So when his name began to surface in connection with a case that would later draw national attention, those who knew him struggled to reconcile the headlines with the person they thought they understood. Because Daniel wasn't the kind of man people expected to be standing in the middle of something like this. And yet, he was the one who made that call. He was the one who said she was gone again. And he was the one who would soon realize that everything he believed about his life had been built on something far more fragile than he ever imagined. The woman he was talking about, who we'll call Emily Carter, had entered his life in a way that felt almost effortless. She was warm, engaging, and carried a kind of energy that drew people in without trying too hard. Where Daniel was steady and reserved, Emily brought movement and change, and for a while, that difference felt like balance. People who saw them together often said they complemented each other, that they filled in the spaces the other didn't naturally occupy. And for a time, that seemed true. They built routines, shared plans, and created a version of life that looked, from the outside, completely normal. But relationships aren't measured by what people see in public. They're shaped by what happens in the quiet moments, the private conversations, and the decisions that never leave the walls of a home. And in those moments, things weren't always as simple as they appeared. There were small incidents at first, the kind that don't immediately raise alarm. A disagreement that lasted longer than it should have. A story that didn't quite match up the next time it was told. A feeling, difficult to explain, that something wasn't lining up the way it used to. Daniel noticed these things, but like many people in long-term relationships, he chose to interpret them in the most reasonable way possible. Stress, misunderstanding, the natural ups and downs that come with time. He adjusted. He overlooked. He gave the benefit of the doubt. Because when you trust someone, you don't immediately assume the worst. You look for explanations that allow everything to continue as it was. And that's exactly what he did. Even when certain moments left him uneasy, he found ways to move past them. Because the alternative would have meant questioning everything, and that's not something most people are ready to do. But then came the first time Emily disappeared. It wasn't dramatic. There was no immediate sign of danger, no clear indication that something had gone wrong. She was simply gone. Her phone unreachable, her routine broken, her presence suddenly missing from a life that had always included her. Daniel reported it, of course. He contacted friends, retraced steps, did everything someone in his position would be expected to do. And then, just as quietly as she had left, she returned. Her explanation was simple, almost too simple. She needed space. She needed time to think. It had nothing to do with him, she said. Nothing serious. Just something she needed to work through on her own. And because there was no clear evidence to challenge that explanation, because there was no immediate reason to doubt her, life slowly returned to normal. At least, on the surface. But something had shifted. Even if it wasn't spoken out loud, even if it wasn't fully understood, the foundation had changed. Because once someone disappears without explanation, even briefly, it leaves behind questions that don't fully go away. Daniel felt it, even if he couldn't define it. A hesitation, a quiet awareness that things might not be as stable as they once seemed. Still, he stayed. He chose to believe her. He chose to continue forward. Because walking away would have meant accepting that something was seriously wrong. And at that point, he wasn't ready to make that conclusion. So he stayed, and life moved on. And for a while, it seemed like whatever had happened was behind them. Until it happened again. This time, the absence felt different. There was no warning, no conversation leading up to it, no sign that she was about to leave. One moment, everything was in place, and the next, it wasn't. And when Daniel made that call, when he said those 3 words, he wasn't just reporting a disappearance. He was stepping into a situation that would force him to confront questions he had been avoiding for a long time. Because this wasn't just about where Emily had gone. It was about why things had unfolded the way they did. It was about what had been happening beneath the surface of a relationship that, to everyone else, looked completely intact. And most importantly, it was about whether the person he trusted most had been telling him the truth at all. Before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. What investigators would soon begin to piece together would challenge every assumption made in those early days. Because as they started looking closer, as timelines were reviewed and small details were re-examined, a different picture began to form. One that didn't match the version of events Daniel had been given. One that suggested that what happened wasn't as simple as someone needing space or time away. And the more they uncovered, the clearer it became that this case wasn't going to follow the path anyone expected. Because sometimes, the truth isn't hidden in one big moment. Sometimes, it's buried in a series of small decisions, small lies, and small choices that, over time, lead to something no one saw coming. And in this case, those choices would come back in a way that would change everything. At first glance, Daniel Carter and Emily Carter looked like any normal couple. They lived in a quiet neighborhood where routines rarely changed, where people waved as they passed by and trusted that what they saw on the surface was the full picture. Their home was modest, but well kept, their lives structured in a way that felt familiar to those around them. There were no obvious signs of trouble, no visible cracks that would suggest something was slowly coming apart. Friends described them as stable, even predictable in the best sense of the word. They attended gatherings together, shared conversations with neighbors, and maintained the kind of presence that blended easily into the rhythm of everyday life. But the truth is, what people see from the outside is often only a fraction of what actually exists. Because behind closed doors, away from casual observation and polite conversation, something about their relationship wasn't aligning the way it should have been. It wasn't one single moment that raised concern, but rather a collection of small inconsistencies that began to build over time. Subtle changes in behavior, conversations that ended without resolution, and a growing sense that certain things were being left unsaid. Daniel noticed these shifts, even if he couldn't fully explain them. There were times when Emily's words didn't quite match her actions, times when her explanations felt incomplete, leaving gaps that were easy to ignore but difficult to forget. Still, he chose to trust her. That trust wasn't forced or naive. It was the result of years spent believing that the person beside him was honest, that whatever didn't make sense in the moment would eventually become clear. But as those small moments continued to repeat, as those gaps remained unfilled, the questions began to take shape, quietly at first, then with increasing weight. Was Emily Carter really the victim in all of this, as it would later be presented to others? Or was there another side to the story that had yet to surface? Why did so many people, including those who barely knew the full details, seemed ready to accept her version of events without hesitation, while Daniel's perspective was met with doubt. And perhaps most importantly, what had been happening within that relationship that no one else had seen? What detail, what pattern, what truth had been present all along but overlooked because it didn't fit the narrative people were more comfortable believing? These weren't questions that could be answered quickly, and they weren't questions that came with simple explanations. They required looking beyond first impressions, beyond assumptions, and into the moments that had quietly shaped everything that followed. Because when situations like this unfold, the initial story is rarely the complete one. There are layers, details that only become visible when time passes and when someone takes the effort to look closer. In the case of Daniel and Emily Carter, those layers would begin to reveal a sequence of events that didn't align with what people first believed. And as those events were examined more carefully, it became clear that the situation wasn't just about a disappearance or a misunderstanding. It was about how perception can be influenced, how trust can be redirected, and how easily a narrative can form before all the facts are truly understood. To understand how everything reached that point, to understand why Daniel made that call, and why those 3 words carried so much weight, it's necessary to go back to the beginning, to the first moments where their paths crossed, long before any questions were raised, and long before anyone could have imagined where those choices would lead. Daniel Carter was the kind of man most people trusted immediately, not because he tried to impress anyone, but because there was nothing about him that felt forced. He lived a structured life, the kind built on routine and responsibility. Every morning followed a pattern, every decision made with care, every obligation met without hesitation. He worked with his hands, spent time in his garage fixing things that others would have thrown away, and took pride in doing things the right way, even when no one was watching. People who knew him would often describe him in simple terms: steady, reliable, someone you could count on without needing to question it. In a world where things often felt uncertain, Daniel represented the opposite of that. He didn't chase excitement, he didn't seek attention, and he didn't make impulsive decisions. He believed in building something stable and protecting it. And for most of his life, that approach had worked. Emily Carter was different in ways that were noticeable from the very beginning. Where Daniel was measured, Emily was expressive. She had a way of drawing people in, of making conversations feel effortless, of turning ordinary moments into something that felt more alive. She smiled easily, spoke with confidence, and carried an energy that stood out without trying too hard. People remembered her after meeting her once, not because she demanded attention, but because she knew how to hold it. When she entered Daniel's life, that difference didn't feel like a problem, it felt like balance. She brought movement into a life that had always been structured, and for a while, that combination seemed to work. They complemented each other in a way that made sense, at least on the surface. Friends saw it, family accepted it, and for a time, even Daniel believed that what they had was exactly what it appeared to be. At first, everything felt right. They settled into routines together, shared responsibilities, and created a version of life that looked complete from the outside. There were plans for the future, conversations about what came next, and a sense that things were moving in the direction they were supposed to. But relationships are not defined by how they begin. They are shaped by what happens when things become familiar. And as time passed, small changes started to appear, subtle enough to overlook, but consistent enough to matter. Emily's behavior began to shift in ways that were difficult to explain. There were moments when her mood would change without warning, conversations that ended abruptly, and reactions that didn't seem to match the situation. At times, she would withdraw, becoming distant in ways that left Daniel uncertain about what had caused it. Then there were the small inconsistencies, details that didn't fully align. Stories that changed slightly depending on when they were told, explanations that answered one question but raised another. None of it was significant enough on its own to cause alarm, but together, they created a pattern that was hard to ignore. Daniel noticed these things, but like many people in his position, he chose to interpret them in the most reasonable way possible. Stress, misunderstanding, the natural complexity of sharing a life with someone else. He adjusted. He gave space when it seemed necessary, and he trusted that whatever fell off would eventually correct itself. Because questioning it too deeply would have meant confronting the possibility that something more serious was happening, and that wasn't a conclusion he was ready to accept. Over time, the distance between them became more noticeable. Emily began to pull away from certain aspects of their shared life, spending less time with the people they both knew, becoming harder to reach, less predictable in ways that Daniel wasn't used to. Friends would ask questions, casual at first, then with more curiosity, but there were never clear answers to give. And while nothing had happened that could be pointed to as a turning point, the overall dynamic had changed. It was no longer the balanced relationship it once seemed to be. It was something else, something less defined, something that left Daniel trying to hold on to a version of their life that no longer existed in the same way. He stayed, not because he didn't notice the changes, but because he believed in what they had built. He believed that whatever was happening could be worked through, that the person he trusted was still there beneath the shifts in behavior he didn't fully understand. And for a while, that belief allowed things to continue without direct confrontation. But there's a limit to how long uncertainty can be ignored before it demands attention. And eventually, that moment arrived. It didn't come with a clear warning or a dramatic build-up. It came quietly, in a way that felt almost ordinary at first. And then, without explanation, without preparation, everything changed. And then came the first incident. It started with something small, something easy to ignore, the kind of moment that doesn't feel important enough to stop everything and question it. One evening, Daniel Carter noticed Emily Carter's phone lighting up repeatedly, messages coming in faster than usual, her reactions quick and controlled, as if she didn't want him to see too much at once. When he asked about it, her response came easily, too easily. Just a friend, nothing serious, something that didn't require further explanation. And for a moment, that answer was enough. But moments like that didn't just happen once. They began to repeat, quietly at first, then with more frequency. Conversations became shorter, explanations more selective, and there were times when Emily would leave the room to take calls she once would have answered openly. None of it was clear evidence of anything. But it was enough to shift the atmosphere, enough to introduce a level of uncertainty that hadn't been there before. The arguments didn't begin all at once. They developed gradually, built on misunderstandings that never fully resolved. Daniel wasn't confrontational by nature, but there were moments when the tension reached a point where silence wasn't an option. He would ask simple questions, looking for clarity, trying to understand what was changing, but the answers he received often led to more confusion. Emily's responses varied, sometimes dismissive, sometimes defensive, and occasionally she would turn the focus back on him, questioning why he was even asking in the first place. What started as calm conversations slowly became disagreements, and those disagreements began to carry a different tone, one that suggested something deeper was being avoided. And yet, even in those moments, there was never a clear admission of anything being wrong, only fragments of explanations that never fully connected. Then came the first time she disappeared. It wasn't preceded by a major argument or a dramatic event that could explain it. One day she was there, following the same routine they had built together, and the next, she wasn't. Her phone went straight to voicemail. Her usual contacts had no information, and there was no indication of where she had gone. Daniel reported it, not out of panic, but out of growing concern that something had shifted beyond his understanding. Hours passed, then more, and just as the situation began to feel serious, she returned. Her explanation was simple. She needed time, she said, needed space to clear her head. There was no urgency in her tone, no acknowledgement of the concern her absence had caused. And because there was no immediate proof to challenge her explanation, the situation settled, at least on the surface. But after that, things didn't return to what they had been. The pattern had changed. There were more moments where Emily seemed distant, more instances where her actions didn't align with what she said. Friends began to notice, not the details, but the shift in how Daniel carried himself, the quiet distraction that followed him even in casual settings. When asked, he gave simple answers. Nothing was wrong, just a phase, something that would pass. But privately, the uncertainty was growing. He couldn't point to a single moment that explained it, but the accumulation of small inconsistencies had begun to feel impossible to ignore. And then it happened again. One night, without warning, without any clear reason, Emily Carter vanished. There was no message this time, no explanation left behind, no indication that she planned to return. The silence that followed was different from before, heavier, more difficult to dismiss as something temporary. When Daniel made that call, when he said she was gone again, it carried a weight that hadn't been there the first time. Because now, this wasn't an isolated incident. This was a pattern, and patterns don't exist without a cause. From Daniel's perspective, he had done everything he could to understand what was happening. He had asked questions, given space, tried to maintain the structure of a relationship that no longer felt stable. From Emily's perspective, at least the version she would later present, the situation looked different. She would describe feeling controlled, misunderstood, needing distance from something she couldn't fully explain at the time. Friends who heard fragments of both sides formed their own opinions, some leaning toward Daniel's consistency, others drawn to Emily's emotional explanations. No one had the full picture, and because of that, no one could say with certainty what was actually happening. The uncertainty is what made the situation difficult to define. There was no clear line separating truth from assumption, no single version of events that everyone could agree on. It was a situation built on partial information, shifting perspectives, and a growing sense that something important was being left unsaid. And then, just as suddenly as before, Emily returned. But when she came back, when the silence was broken and explanations were offered, nothing made sense anymore. Police began asking questions, but the answers didn't add up in the way they expected. When officers first spoke with Daniel Carter, his account was consistent with what he had reported. He explained the timeline as clearly as he could, the last time he saw Emily Carter, the attempts he made to reach her, the growing concern that led him to call for help. There was nothing immediately alarming in his tone, nothing that suggested panic beyond what would be expected from someone in his position. But as investigators started to examine the details more closely, small inconsistencies began to appear. Not enough to confirm wrongdoing, but enough to raise further questions. The timing of certain events didn't align perfectly with available records, and while Daniel's explanation accounted for most of it, there were still gaps that couldn't be ignored. At the same time, Emily's version of events introduced a different set of complications. When she returned, her explanation once again centered on needing space, on stepping away from something she described as overwhelming. But this time, investigators weren't relying solely on what was said. They began comparing her statements with what could be verified, and while some elements matched, others didn't fully hold up under closer review. There were moments she couldn't clearly account for, details that shifted slightly depending on how the questions were asked. And yet, none of it provided a clear conclusion. Her story didn't completely align with the evidence, but neither did Daniel's. Instead of pointing in one direction, the information seemed to move in multiple directions at once, creating a situation where certainty was difficult to reach. As the investigation continued, additional factors began to surface. Neighbors who had initially described the couple as quiet and unremarkable started recalling small details that hadn't seemed important before. A conversation overheard weeks earlier, a late-night argument that had gone unnoticed at the time, a pattern of behavior that, in hindsight, felt different than it first appeared. These accounts didn't confirm anything on their own, but they added to the overall picture, a picture that was becoming increasingly complex. Phone records were reviewed next, and while they provided a timeline of communication, they also introduced new questions. There were calls made at unusual times, messages sent and deleted, and gaps in activity that didn't clearly correspond with either Daniel's or Emily's explanations. Financial records added another layer. Transactions that seemed routine at first glance took on new meaning when placed within the timeline of events. Purchases, withdrawals, movements of money that didn't directly point to a motive but suggested that something more was happening beneath the surface. Investigators followed each lead carefully, not jumping to conclusions, but not dismissing anything either. Because in cases like this, it's often the smallest detail that changes everything. And at this point, there were too many small details that didn't fully connect. Public perception began to shift as fragments of the case became known. Some people believed Daniel's version of events, pointing to his consistency and the life he had built over the years. Others were more inclined to believe Emily, focusing on her emotional account and the possibility that there was more to the story than what had been initially presented. The lack of a clear narrative allowed speculation to grow, and with each new piece of information, the uncertainty only increased. At this point, no one knew who to believe. Every answer seemed to create another question. Every explanation left something unresolved. Investigators continued to piece together the timeline, reviewing evidence, revisiting statements, and looking for anything that could provide clarity. It was during one of these reviews, something routine, something that initially seemed insignificant, that they came across a detail that didn't belong. It wasn't something they had been searching for specifically, and it wasn't something that had been highlighted in earlier stages of the investigation. But once it was noticed, it couldn't be ignored. Because what they uncovered in that moment didn't just add to the case, it changed the direction of it entirely. It was something they weren't supposed to find, something that suggested that the situation was far more calculated than anyone had originally believed. Hidden deep in the evidence was a pattern, one that hadn't been obvious at first because it didn't appear in a single place. It was spread across timelines, small details, and moments that seemed unrelated until they were placed side by side. Investigators began to notice that Emily Carter's disappearances weren't as random as they had initially believed. The timing, the communication gaps, even the way certain events unfolded all followed a structure that suggested intention rather than impulse. Phone records that once looked incomplete now showed coordination, messages sent just before key moments, calls placed in ways that created distance between what could be verified and what could be explained. Financial activity, previously seen as ordinary, revealed subtle preparation, small movements that aligned too closely with the times she would later claim to have stepped away. None of it alone proved anything, but together, it formed a sequence that was difficult to dismiss. As investigators mapped everything out, the pattern became clearer. Emily had been shaping the narrative in advance, creating situations where her version of events would appear more believable while quietly introducing doubt around Daniel Carter's actions. Statements she made early on were reinforced by carefully timed behavior, while inconsistencies in Daniel's timeline, even minor ones, were amplified by comparison. It wasn't immediate or obvious, but it was effective. Over time, the perception of what was happening began to shift, not because of one major piece of evidence, but because of how multiple smaller details aligned in a specific direction. This wasn't random. It wasn't the result of confusion or miscommunication. It had been planned, not in a way that drew attention to itself, but in a way that blended into the normal flow of events. When this realization took hold, the entire case changed. What had once been viewed as a complicated situation with two conflicting perspectives now appeared to follow a deliberate structure. The disappearances, the explanations, the emotional responses, each element served a purpose that only became visible after everything was placed in order. And at the center of it all was Daniel Carter, the person who had trusted without hesitation, the person who had adjusted and accommodated, believing that the relationship could return to what it once was. Instead, that trust had been used against him, slowly, carefully, without drawing attention until it was too late to reverse the damage. The emotional weight of that realization extended beyond the investigation itself. For those reviewing the case, it raised questions about how easily perception can be influenced, how a consistent narrative can be built through repetition and timing rather than truth. For Daniel, it meant confronting the idea that the person he had built his life around had not only withheld the truth, but had actively shaped events in a way that placed him at the center of suspicion. The life he believed he understood had been constructed on something that no longer held. And as the full sequence of events came into focus, it became clear that the situation was never what it appeared to be. The person he trusted most had been working against him, not in a single moment, but over time, in ways that were only now becoming impossible to ignore. But even after everything, the truth wasn't that simple. As the investigation moved toward its conclusion, what had once seemed like a clear direction began to shift again. The pattern investigators uncovered raised serious concerns, but it didn't provide a complete answer to every question surrounding Daniel Carter and Emily Carter. There were still gaps, still moments that couldn't be fully explained, still pieces of the timeline that left room for interpretation. When the case reached its final stages, the outcome reflected that uncertainty. It wasn't the kind of resolution people expect, where everything is neatly explained and every action has a clear motive. Instead, it was something far more complicated, shaped by evidence that pointed in multiple directions and by a narrative that had been influenced from the very beginning. For some, the findings confirmed their suspicions. For others, they only deepened the sense that something important remained unresolved. Daniel Carter was left to face the aftermath of a situation that had changed the course of his life in ways he never anticipated. The trust he had placed in Emily Carter, the decisions he had made based on that trust, and the way events had unfolded all became part of a reality he could not undo. Even as the investigation closed, questions lingered about what had truly happened behind the scenes, about how much had been carefully constructed and how much had simply evolved over time. Emily Carter's role in that story remained a subject of debate, defined differently depending on who was interpreting the evidence. Some saw a calculated sequence of actions. Others saw a series of reactions shaped by circumstances that were never fully understood. And in that space between certainty and doubt, the case found its final form, not as a clear answer, but as an open question. In the end, this wasn't just a story about a disappearance or an investigation. It was a story about how easily trust can be placed, how difficult it can be to recognize when something isn't right, and how perception can shape reality long before the full truth is revealed. It showed how small moments, overlooked at the time, can eventually define everything that follows. And it left behind a question that doesn't belong only to Daniel Carter or Emily Carter, but to anyone listening to what happened. Would you have seen the signs before it was too late, or would you have done exactly the same, trusting that what you believed was real could never turn into something else entirely? What do you think really happened? Was Daniel Carter simply a victim of circumstances, someone who trusted the wrong person at the wrong time, or was there something else entirely that we haven't fully uncovered? The story of Daniel and Emily Carter raises questions that don't have easy answers, and the more you think about it, the more you start to notice the small details that might have signaled what was coming. And if this story surprised you, if it left you questioning how trust can be manipulated and relationships can unravel in ways you never imagined, then wait until you hear what happened in the next case. There are stories out there even more shocking, moments that challenge perception, and sequences of events that will make you reconsider how much you really know about the people around you. Subscribe for more real stories that will make you think twice before trusting again. And don't forget to share your thoughts in the comments below. Every perspective matters, and we want to hear where you're watching from and what you think happened to Daniel Carter in those final moments.